a march towards a technocratic state, towards using technology to expand the totalitarian state in a way that we've never seen before. But it's also the first time that the U.S. is going beyond an ID that is issued by your state, by Texas, by New York, by California, what have you.
The federal government says it's finally going to start enforcing the Real ID Act, nearly 2 decades after it was passed. They tell us it's all about keeping us safe. But could Real ID open the door to digital surveillance, biometric databases, and a future where you'll need a government-issued ID to participate in everyday life? My name is James Lee, and you're watching Beyond the Headlines on Breaking Points. You might have heard that starting May 7th, Americans will need a Real ID compliant license to board a plane or enter a federal building. The Real ID Act was passed back in 2005 in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, sold to the public as a post-9/11 safety measure, a quote-unquote long-delayed upgrade to protect our elections and national security. What you might not know is how this push fits into a much larger agenda, one that some say includes mobile driver's licenses, biometric facial recognition, and partnerships between government agencies, global institutions, and big tech to roll out digital IDs across the country. Now, to help us break all of this down, I recently sat down with independent journalist Derrick Broze, a prominent voice warning us about the dangers of digital identity systems. And here is that conversation.
Thanks for having me on, James. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So we're gonna hopefully dive deep into this, but I first want to start with maybe the basics for people who haven't looked into it much. What exactly is a Real ID, and how is it that different from an old driver's license system that we've had for decades?
Sure. So you sort of outlined the beginning of it, which was 9/11. And of course, after 9/11, calls for making the country safer. How can we prevent terrorists from entering the nation? How do we, keep track of everybody in a way that is, supposedly going to reduce crime, reduce terrorism. Now, it's been 20 years since then, and there's less talk of terrorism in the ways there were post 9/11, but there's still this discussion, I'd say now more, especially with the right wing, of how are we going to keep track of all the voters? How are we going to keep track of illegal immigrants, et cetera? So the same ideas are still being pushed. As you mentioned, it's been delayed numerous times through every administration up until this point. And now the deadline is finally here. The thing that makes it different just on a practical level is people will notice you might have like a little star in your driver's license. So many people already probably have these and just didn't realize that they got them, because over the last 20 years, as state by state has started to become compliant, more and more people are getting these, like I said, whether they realize them or not. So now we're at the point where all across the nation, everybody's going to have one of these to enter federal buildings, to do various things in the country. And the main thing, though, is just that you'll notice a little star. They promise that there's some more counterfeit measures. So on the practical level, that's pretty much it. You won't really see anything different. We're not at the point where it's just your face to get in somewhere. But as I have written about recently, I do think that's where it's headed, particularly at the airports and federal buildings and places like that. But for the moment, it's simply just a change in the look of your ID.
Yeah, you mentioned you wrote an article about this. So I wanted to dive into that a little bit. And you wrote, quote, "Real ID is the latest move inching Americans closer to mandatory digital identification programs, not only for voting, but for daily life." Can you walk us through a little bit of how this, seemingly innocuous Real ID requirement connects to this argument that you're making, a much larger and broader infrastructure, things like mobile driver's licenses, facial recognition, digital ID system? Basically, lay out your theory for us.
Sure. And I don't think it's very far-fetched, first I'll say, because in order to be Real ID compliant, there's a few things you can do. One is what we just described, just get an update of your driver's license, your state ID, and it's going to have the little star in it, and then you'll be Real ID compliant. The other is to continue to use a passport. So if you're someone like me who only has a passport, then, you just keep doing what you've been doing. But there are also other forms of being Real ID compliant. One of them is known as mobile driver's license, or just MDLs. And again, people might be using these already because there are certain states that have adopted them in the last few years without realizing that it's Real ID compliant. But essentially what a mobile driver's license is, there's several versions. Some in certain states are government run, government owned. So you have a, My ID, insert state name. Then there's others that accept Apple and Google Wallet, Google ID sort of apps to become Real ID compliant. And what these are basically doing, in my mind, and is just getting people, as you quoted me there, a bit closer to this Real ID, this digital ID, facial recognition everywhere. Because to be Real ID compliant, the easiest way is to get the idea, but you could also just start using your phone. Many people are doing this everywhere, and they're also scanning their face to open their phone. So maybe hearing this is not like some big concern to many people. But if you've been paying attention the last decade to digital rights, digital privacy, people much more informed than me, lawyers, NGOs, nonprofits who focus on these issues particularly, have been warning about the growth of facial recognition, have been warning about the growth of digital IDs, and how as those systems become more interconnected, starting with, okay, you have your identification to get into federal buildings on an app, but then over time, as these systems expand, which they will, both in the private sector and through government, to include your health information, to include your banking, financial information, et cetera, you end up being very close to what China has in the version, in their form of WeChat, and the one app that sort of has everything in it. And again, this is going to be sold in a way that's convenient, it's fast. We're seeing this at the airport. People are being encouraged to go paperless and to just use their face to check in. And we've heard from the airports that maybe as soon as this fall, but definitely in the next couple of years, they plan to make facial recognition a mandatory part of the check-in process. So in all different sectors, starting with the Real ID, with mobile driver's license, and especially at the airports, we're seeing this push towards digital identifications. And mobile driver's license is just one form of that. I'll also just note briefly that the TSA has already made it clear on their own website that they will accept mobile driver's licenses as a Real ID compliant ID. And again, they've also got pages on their website showing you how you can skip the whole ID part at all and just do facial recognition, which they're starting to roll out at different terminals. So overall, I don't think it's a big leap to kind of point out what we expect to see in the next couple of years. I don't think it's going to happen by the end of this year that digital IDs will be everywhere, but I do think becoming Real ID compliant with things like mobile driver's license is definitely taking us in that direction.
Right. And you brought up China there. I was recently there, and they certainly have a very robust identification protocol in a lot of places that you go, public areas, including, travel as well as the mall, things like that. But to kind of give the other side of the story a little bit, some say, there's kind of these trade-offs with privacy concerns, and maybe they're a bit exaggerated in what you're talking about. The Real ID, is it just a natural evolution from going from paper to a digital world? And I'm wondering how you would respond to people who say, if you're not really doing anything wrong, what's the danger here? What's the problem?
Well, I just got to say, I love that phrase because we've been hearing it for 20 years now, since 9/11. And in the wake of 9/11, when we saw people being kidnapped off the streets, what the US government likes to call rendition, or people being taken away to be torture, what they like to call enhanced interrogation, there was a lot of that discussion. If you're not doing anything wrong, if you have nothing to hide, who cares if the NSA is spying on your phones? Who cares if these things are going on? I mean, I think people could make that excuse all day to justify a march towards a technocratic state, towards using technology to expand the totalitarian state in a way that we've never seen before. But even if people are skeptical or say that there's no big deal, okay, I'm already using my phone to do everything I do, what's one more thing? Or often I'll hear people say, well, you already gave them your face, you already gave them your information when you signed up for your regular ID or for the passport. And that is true. But as you pointed out, with China's robust digital ID system, once these systems become more connected, then it's a whole new level. The other concern I have, besides just the general surveillance and tracking you everywhere you go, being able to trace every purchase you make, is that this is also a step towards a national ID card. And thankfully, when it first passed, there was former Congressman and presidential candidate Ron Paul who was speaking against this. Currently, I think Thomas Massie is the only person who's really speaking against this and making these points. But it's also the first time that the U.S. is going beyond an ID that is issued by your state, by Texas, by New York, by California, what have you, and something that is now mandated by the federal government. And so if you go back to those post 9/11 years, and you can read some editorials, you can see some congressional speeches, There weren't many because people were in the hype of post 9/11 and just give the government whatever they need to do. We all need to feel safe. But there were people warning about this from the beginning. And so 20 years later, the American public has been kind of worn down. Also, people who were born post 9/11 have no awareness that this was even a controversy. But it's another step towards having a national ID card. And as I said, when you're bringing on the systems that we know are rolling out, both privately and publicly, facial recognition, digital IDs, you could end up in a very dangerous situation where the government knows everywhere you go, even more than they currently do, and knows every purchase you're making. And as we've seen in the last few years, when you combine that with a sort of, whether you want to call it cancel culture or just people who are talking about controversial topics who've been debanked or taken off social media, what happens whenever all of that's run through one central app? And I've already seen this in places like Denmark, for example, is a country I recently visited, speaking about these concerns. And they informed me, Derrick, we already have this. We have a My ID program where you can't go in to any, you can't do public transportation, you can't get insurance, can't open up a bank account, can't get a home, etc. So essentially, it's not mandatory, but you can't function without it. And so I think that's the other big concern, is that as these things roll out, there becomes no way to operate outside of those systems, and within those systems becomes tightly controlled.
Yeah, I know you mentioned, or you just mentioned there, potentially people getting grabbed off the streets for crimes they may or may not have committed, or they're being suspected of something. Certainly, that seems like it's happening as we go, and I'm not sure if this might be a kind of a speculative question, but when we talked about the law being passed in 2005 post 9/11, and the enforcement kept getting delayed up until now, do you think there is, or why do you think there is some kind of push to finally enforce it in 2025? Has anything changed about the circumstances that would warrant them finally enforcing this law?
Well, like you said, this is a bit speculative, so keep that in mind. I would say that I find it interesting that every administration, including Trump's first administration, has delayed this, and both right and left have kind of given the states more time at the least. I won't say every administration was like, the Real ID is a danger per se, but they kept kicking it down the road because states were just resisting. There was lots of lawsuits. Again, people who aren't familiar with this history, look up the lawsuits about Real ID related to dozens of states who have tried to resist it. But nevertheless, here we are in 2025. And as you said, with people being taken off the streets right now under the Trump campaign, Trump administration, and relation to immigration, relation to speaking out against Israel, and part of that conversation, of course, is the discussion around illegal immigrants voting and how do we secure the border and these sorts of things. I think that the Real ID coming into compliance, full compliance during the Trump administration, whether planned or just happenstance, it works out in the favor of the government, because many of the people on the right, conservatives, who may have resisted this under, say, a Biden or Obama administration or Clinton administration, are making, in my view, excuses and saying it's no big deal. It's Trump's program. It's rolling out under Trump, so it can't possibly be bad. And of course, it's going to stop all those bad illegal immigrants from coming in the country. And so I think that overall, the fact that it's happening now, it might make the rollout a bit easier and less resistance from the crowd who may have resisted if it, was under any other circumstances.
Yeah, I do find it kind of interesting that they bring up, national security and election integrity as core reasons of why we need to implement it. But in reality, you can get on an airplane without a Real ID if you just use a passport. So foreigners can definitely just get on an airplane. And also, you can get a Real ID if you're not an American citizen. Migrant workers, they're eligible to get a Real ID. So I'm not sure if those issues are even interrelated at all. It might be a little bit of a misdirection from government officials in these kind of talking points. But the final question I wanted to ask you is, for people watching and are feeling kind of uneasy about this, maybe they don't want to get a Real ID, or they don't want to get their face scanned at the airport, or, get their ID stored in some kind of digital wallet. What can they realistically do at this point to protect their privacy? Is it possible to resist at this point?
I think there is still a way to resist. I mean, obviously the time to resist was the last 20 years. And, now that we're a couple of weeks away from the rollout, May 7th, it's going to be required everywhere. One, I guess, minor form of resistance, because I've been seeing these conversations and, online and all the the chat and everywhere about the deadline looming. And some people seem to be saying, well, I'm going to try to go back to my, my local government office and see if I can get my old ID back because I didn't even realize that I had the real ID. I don't think that's going to happen. Others are saying that they're going to opt for just keeping the passport. That's, again, sort of what I've done. Obviously, in some ways, you have to still, obviously, you're taking a picture, you're giving the government your information. So I don't think it's really a concern about handing that data over. I think it's the concerns I pointed out about national ID card and digital ID cards. Other ways to resist, I mean, there are some politicians speaking out. Like I mentioned, Thomas Massey is one of the few. And then in terms of the facial recognition, I see Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley. He's been one of the few speaking out about the rollout of facial recognition at the airports. If people are politically inclined, which I'm personally not, you might want to reach out to the offices of those gentlemen and others who may be speaking up and see, what their plans are to do about this going forward. And there are some people who are saying this is going to be the end of travel for them. They feel that strongly enough that they're not going to comply. I guess, I'm not going to get a new ID until mine expires, and then I'll figure it out at that point. But overall, I do think that the bigger picture we need to be thinking about is how we relate to these forms of technology. I actually wrote a book in 2020 called How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, which covered much of this information. People can download it for free at theconsciousresistance.com/how-to. And I explored these ideas, like what does it mean to be moving into a world with digital IDs, facial recognition, and how does our individual liberty and collective liberty and privacy remain and stay alive in that world? And the answer is not easy. I think it's very difficult, but it's going to be up to each individual and each family to decide what systems they want to relate and connect with and how they choose to operate within that. Some people might operate more on the extreme end and just eschew all IDs, in favor of, the potential consequences. Others are just probably going to go along with it. Facial recognition is rolling out at the airports. There are places like sports stadiums that are starting to test it out as well. And it's my belief that the places where it is most likely people will comply, airports where people want to make that flight, sports stadiums where people want to go see their favorite team, people will go ahead and normalize this sort of thing. And as that happens, it's going to spread further and further beyond the airports and the sports stadiums. I don't know how a person who wants to avoid that in the long term can do so if they make no changes. I think it's going to involve personal lifestyle changes and maybe even philosophical changes to remain free from those systems as they emerge. But at the moment, we're not there yet. But my goal, I guess, here is to try to warn people that I think this is what's on the horizon. And I do think that's backed by plenty of data. So, if you haven't thought about this, I encourage you to start thinking about it because the future is here.
Yeah, speaking of the future, well, I just want to say that for a country who espouses a lot of anti-China sentiment, we are certainly adopting a lot of Chinese-style policies, which is interesting to say the least. But I know you mentioned your website, your book there. Anywhere else that you want to point people to follow you, Derrick?
I appreciate that. And thanks again for having me on. Yeah, my main website that I've been running since 2013 is called the Conscious Resistance Network. You can find it at theconsciousresistance.com. I have my documentaries there, my books, podcasts, etc. You can find all that. I'm also a contributing writer at thelastamericanvagabond.com, which is where this article we're discussing today came from. That's thelastamericanvagabond.com, where Ryan Christian and Whitney Webb and others contribute there. And you can find me on Twitter. You can find me on social media. I will continue to stay on top of this issue as well as others. And I hope more people will start thinking about this in a deeper manner.
Absolutely. Thanks, Derrick. Really appreciate your time and your insights today.
Thank you.
To learn more about Real ID and the other stories mainstream media doesn't want to cover, you can head on over to my YouTube channel, 5149 with James Lee. The link will be in the description below. Thank you for your time today and keep on tuning into Breaking Points.